Welcome to r/Reddit Revenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. Thank you friends for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story. Woman's hatred towards her son's wife resulted in an expensive paternity test. Years later, the son got his revenge by reminding his mother of the money she owed him. The second story. Temp agency screwed me over, so I refused to help with a HIPAA audit. The third story. Steve landed his ex-girlfriend with an $80 phone bill. She contacted his mother for repayment, which was promptly sorted. The first story. Some vengeance takes 20 years. Got the money back in the end, and also some regretful tears. Not my story, but my father's. This story is about my grandma, my father's mother. Let's call her Ellen. Ellen has always hated my mother. I think one reason is because my father and his family is very white. They aren't racist, but I think deep down she is a bit. But the other reason is because my mother doesn't take SH from anyone. Examples of things Ellen did and my mother didn't like. 1. Going inside the home of my parents and start opening their letters. 2. SHing on the tiniest piece of dirt in their home. Even she isn't Mr. Clean. 3. Trying to pin everything that goes wrong on my mother, even things my dad or I chose to do. Oh, I bet that was the idea of your stupid mother. 4. Trying and succeeding to take the first children of my mother away. That's another long story. 5. Then trying to take me away but backing out because I'm pretty sure my mom would have ended her this time. I don't blame her. I would too. 6. Telling my whole family I was lying when her internet boyfriend tried to do things to me as a 7-year-old. You just shouldn't do. So anyway, you get the idea. A horrible person. No one was good enough for her son, my dad. When my mom and dad got their first child together, my brother, Jude, he looked a lot more like my mother. My mother's biological father was/is black. Her biological mother was white. I always like to call her skin tone cappuccino with a tiny bit of milk. Haha. She also has tiny, gorgeous curls I'm a bit jealous of. My dad, on the other hand, is just white. Straight brown hair, brown eyes. Jude is a lot darker than my mother, but has her curls and it looks overall not very much white like my dad. So Ellen was convinced that my mother must have cheated, and Jude couldn't possibly be the child of my father and her grandchild. She didn't let the topic go, and back at the time, my dad was still very attached to his family. He was only 18 and my mother was 21. So when Ellen wouldn't stop bothering my father to do a paternity test, he finally said he would do it, but only if she paid it, if Jude turned out to be his son. So she agreed. He did the test, which cost about $2,000 today. It was another currency back then, but still very expensive. The only reason my parents had the money was because they were saving for a wedding. My mother originally didn't want to get married, but my father was very good at changing her mind. He fell in love with her when he was only 14, and wouldn't stop confessing his love and singing cringy love songs until she finally gave in 4 years later. Still together to this day. So the test came back and surprise, surprise, he was the father. So he wanted the money back, because it was a huge chunk of money. Not only for the wedding, but they just had a baby. If she did give him the money, we wouldn't be here today. So she didn't, even though she had the money. My grandparents were pretty wealthy back then. My mother was super hurt in a real wedding, with a dress and in a church like my father wanted was totally canceled. The only reason my mother married my dad 12 years later, and not in a church but in like the town hall. I don't know how it's called in English, but you just sign something and you're married. No long talks or guest food or a pretty church or even a dress. Was because I was really annoying as a child. I always wanted my parents to be married, and it got them some benefits, like with taxes and for medical emergencies and so on. So of course my dad was bitter about it, really bitter. But the revenge part would take more than 20 years. Last year my whole family got into e-bikes. Literally everyone got one. First my dad used the one of Ellen, but he wanted his own. Due to a really bad credit score, he couldn't get one on his name or my mother, and because he is her favorite son, he talked Ellen into getting him one. Of course he would pay for her every month back. I think you can see where this is going. So she buys him an expensive e-bike, almost the price of the paternity test, and my dad paid the first month, maybe even the second. But then he stops. Ellen starts complaining, even before he stops paying to everyone in the family. He isn't paying. That stupid wife of him is robbing me of money. It's not like she even needed the money. Her pension is very generous and she's in another country for vacation almost every 3 months for weeks. Of course my father knows why he stopped paying, but because she wouldn't stop complaining to everybody, he had to remind her. So the next time she brought it up, he straight up reminded her of the time over 20 years ago where she forced him to take that stupid test, didn't pay him back like she said she would, and destroyed not only the wedding but also their savings and a part of their relationship. I don't know if she thought somehow my dad would forget something like this, or the other stuff she pulled, just to somehow break them off. She started tearing up and got really quiet. I really wish I was there to take a photo of that shiny little tear of regret and realization, but oh well. So she paid for the bike in silence, and no one of us has heard her talking about my father or mother, who wouldn't pay her for the bike anymore. Karma coming back to bite you in the butt. Ellen sounds like the kind of person who would step on a Lego and blame it on the nearest child. It's funny how she was so convinced that Jude wasn't your father's child, but in the end it was her own deceitful behavior that was exposed. It just goes to show that if you go digging for dirt, you're bound to get dirty yourself. It's also funny how some people just can't let things go. Ellen's still complaining to everyone who would listen about your dad not paying for the e-bike. I'm glad your father and mother were able to stay together despite her meddling. But revenge is a dish best served cold, and your father definitely took advantage of that. Your dad got the money back and a little bit of satisfaction too. I hope he enjoys his e-bike and rides it with the wind in his hair, laughing all the way to the bank. I think Ellen will learn her lesson and stop being such a difficult person to deal with. Or maybe she'll just keep on being Ellen. The second story is hanging up never felt so good. My daughter's birthday is coming up and I remembered this lovely event. Before my wife got pregnant, I took a job with a temp agency that told me the position was temp to hire. While I was working there, we found out we were expecting. To make a long story short, they cut my pay, refused to find me a new work location, lied about the length of the contract, and then stopped taking my calls. I was told my contract would end right on December 31st. My wife and I talked it over and we decided that since my daughter was due at the end of January, I would just take some time off to be with her, and then help with the baby. On the 21st of December, I was advised that the 23rd was my last day. Confused, I called the temp agency and was told they ended my contract early, so they would not have to pay half a week. No, they did not have a new contract for me and asked if I knew how to file for unemployment. Screw it. I left and spent some of the best times with my wife. 2 weeks later, I get a call from the temp agency telling me they need to run a credit check for me and asked for W-2s so they could run it. No problem, some job is better than no job. So we rushed out and faxed them over. The next day, he called again telling me they needed more info. So I emailed him what I had. Again, this was not good enough and asked me to sign a waiver so they could get all the info. I asked him what the job was that needed this much info. Turned out they never completed my background check when I got hired, and now they're facing a HIPAA audit, and they're trying to catch up. I laughed and told him no. After this, we did not hear anything for a couple of weeks. Then our daughter was born. So the hospital decided that our daughter was not gaining enough weight, so every day for a week we had to take her in to be checked at 8 a.m. So going on no sleep, we had to bundle her up, put wife in car, and fight for parking at our local hospital. Of course, that week is when the dude from the temp agency starts calling while I'm trying to find a parking place at the hospital. Now he's begging me to fill out the form. First day, I tried to be nice, advised I was tired from being up and down all night with a newborn, and told him I gave him all the information I had. Next day, he calls again. I told him they screwed me over and I really did not feel like helping him out. After a particularly rough night, I dropped off my wife and started my slog to find a parking spot. He calls again. This time he tells me, look, I did not want to have to say this, but if I do not get this from you, I'm going to get fired. I was peeved at this point and asked, I can tell you how to file for unemployment, and hung up and then blocked the number. Sure, it was petty, but it felt good. I found out later that he had been fired after all. Karma's a bee. That temp agency really screwed him over, but it sounds like he got the last laugh in the end. And as for that guy from the temp agency, he got what he deserved. You don't mess with a man who's sleep deprived and trying to find parking at a hospital. First, they want a credit check, then they want a background check, then they want your DNA sample and your firstborn child. What job are you applying for, the FBI? Anyway, it's good to know that karma can still come around and bite people in the butt. This guy got to be with his family, and that's all that really matters. This guy went through a lot just trying to provide for his family. So let's raise a glass to him and his beautiful daughter, and hope that the temp agency learned their lesson. And if they didn't, well, there's always the satisfaction of hanging up on them again. The last story is, cheating ex tried to land me with a huge phone bill, so I ratted to his mother. This was a good few years ago now, but it still puts a smile on my face. I'd been in a relationship with a guy, let's call him Steve, who seemed super nice on the surface, but turned out to be pretty manipulative and a habitual cheater. While we were together, I took out a phone contract for Steve in my name, as his credit score was poor, and the company wouldn't give him one. It was all fine, and I never had any problems with him paying me back, even when we broke up. Then a month before the contract was up, I had a bombshell dropped on me by a mutual friend who had found out the extent of Steve's cheating and lies and thought I deserved to know. I'd once been suspicious about Steve's relationship with a particular woman, but when my suspicions came out, he gaslit the hell out of me and turned himself into the victim. Turns out my suspicions had been right on the money after all. Needless to say, I confronted Steve. though I did it as coolly as I could. I was peeved. I'd wasted literal years of my life being taken for an idiot. Not only that, but the manipulation had continued long after the breakup, as we'd stayed friends, and I was finally done with it. I told him that I was cutting him out of my life, and that I never wanted to hear from him again. My confrontation didn't go down well, but by this point he'd already sent me the money for the final month of the contract, so I thought it was all okay on that front. I was wrong. Turns out Steve could still rack up a pretty big charge if he went over his data allowance, something he'd always been super careful not to do. That's why I was pretty sure it was deliberate when I was sent a bill for close to $80. I could have covered the bill and kept that door closed, but it would have been at the expense of other things, and I wasn't about to let that slide on top of everything else he'd put me through. I contacted the company to make sure the charge wasn't down to some overseen contract clause, and that he had really stacked up that bill in excess charges alone. He had. Seems like he didn't like no longer having control over me. Determined to get my money back, I tried to get in touch with Steve, but he blocked me on every single avenue of contact I had for him. It was then I realized that I still had his mother's number in my contacts. Immediately, I texted her with an outline of what had happened, that I'd confronted her son about his treatment of me, and that I was convinced he'd deliberately landed me with a big phone bill as some sort of petty payback. While she wasn't impressed that her son's drama was landing on her doorstep via me, she asked for proof of the bill and said she'd sort it out. The money landed in my account within an hour and I was free of him forever. I wish I'd seen the look on his face when his mother made him, a grown-A man, sort it out. That was no small amount of money to him at the time either. I know he occasionally still stirs SH about me years later, as the odd petty comment on his social media sometimes makes it back to me through friends. If anything, this makes my petty determination even sweeter. Having the money was nice, but getting the last laugh was better. Not only did the ex-boyfriend cheat, but he also tried to stick the poor girl with a massive phone bill. But little did he know that his ex-girlfriend had a secret weapon, his own mother. Great to see this girl taking control of the situation and standing up for herself. It's never easy to confront someone who has treated you badly, but she did it with grace and style. She came out on top with her money back and her dignity intact. So here's to all the cheating exes out there. Watch out for your mom's phone number in your ex-girlfriend's contact list. Subscribe, click the like button if you want to support the channel. Thank you for watching.